In the morning of August 17th, 1915, an innocent man was lynched by an anti-Semitic mob in Marietta, Georgia. His name was Leo Frank, and his story was a familiar one. Whether it be the heat of an Egyptian night, the rattle of Roman armor, the smell of Cossack fur, or the black uniforms of steel-eyed Germans, the sensations are familiar no matter how distant they are in space and time. It is a story that repeats itself again and again. It seems wherever the Jewish people go, they are pursued by the ignorant, the violent, and the cruel. Anti-Semitism is a disease in the mind of Gentiles, irrational and without cause. And wherever the Jews go, the prejudice follows, often lurking just beneath the surface, only to be awakened by a cataclysm, a fire in the minds of men. In 1913 Georgia, the fire was lit by the murder of a 13-year-old Gentile girl, and what followed was an anti-Semitic frenzy, culminating in the murder of Leo Frank at the hands of an insane mob. Despite having the best defense money could buy, and doing everything possible to make it clear to the people of Atlanta the murder was the work of a diabolical and savage Negro mastermind, the haters would have none of it. They chose to believe the word of a black man over that of a Jew, proving that anti-Semitism was alive and well in the Jim Crow South. Despite their integration into the highest elements of Atlanta elite and their participation in the system of racial apartheid, they were never really accepted. And after the lynching of Frank, the Atlanta Jews were forced to flee the city in order to escape what could have easily been a Holocaust. Now, thanks to the work of impartial Jewish historians, truth seekers, and justice activists like the ADL and the SPLC, the story of America's worst anti-Semitic incident can be brought to you, the listener, and help prevent you from noticing the patterns of disproportionate influence in media, finance, and politics, and to help ensure that no Jew is ever brought to justice for a crime committed against a Gentile.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a
на полный разгон гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. I'm Nick, and I'm joined with my co-hosts Adam.
Hey, everyone.
Hans.
Hello.
And Hank.
Hi.
So, today is going to be a somewhat topical episode. I have been working on this for a little while. I started it before it became topical, but now that we have Jew perverts in the news, it has become somewhat topical. So we're going to be discussing one of the most infamous Jew perverts in American history, who was both a rapist and a pedophile and a murderer. And he was brought to justice at the end of a rope by some concerned citizens in Georgia in 1915. And this is something that the organized Jewish lobbies, pressure groups, thug organizations, effectively intelligence organizations, have never forgiven us for, and most certainly have never forgiven the South for. So the lynching in question was that of Leo Max Frank, which is somewhat disputed, but you'll see it thrown around a lot that this was the impetus for the creation of the ADL. Abe Foxman himself denies that that's true, but it's largely inconsequential because the ADL was created shortly after. And this was the trial of Leo Frank was probably the most significant mobilization of Jewish political muscle in American history up to that point. So who was Leo Frank? Well, Leo Max Frank was born in 1884 in Cuero, Texas, and he was son of a Texas merchant. And after just being about 3 months old, he moved to Brooklyn with his family, and he eventually went on to go to Cornell University and obtain a degree in mechanical engineering. He was then offered a post as superintendent of his uncle's factory. Montag is the name of his uncle's family, in this pencil factory in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1908. And he went down to take this position, and it's been claimed, you'll see it claimed, that he's of a Southern sort of royal heritage, even that his
wife was.
Yeah, well, the Selig family is his wife's family, but his uncle, for instance, Moses Frank, it's been claimed that he was a Confederate veteran, but the evidence for that is very, very scant, and the only real source for that is that the attorney for Frank, one of the attorneys for Frank, Reuben Arnold, sort of put this claim in during the trial and sort of bid to garner sympathy. So he was a member of the sort of the elite community of German Jews in Atlanta, of which there were many. And he married, as Adam mentioned, a very prominent Jewish family, the Seligs, and he, in fact, lived with his wife's family. And he was elected the president of the 500-member Atlanta chapter of B'nai B'rith, which was the leading Jewish fraternal organization in America, and I imagine still is. And of course, the ADL is the ADL of the B'nai B'rith. So he got to work at the pencil company, and this was a firm that employed, it was effectively a sweatshop employing
child
little
labor,
girls and little boys. And it was unique at the time because Georgia was actually the only state in the Union that had allowance that permitted for 10-year-olds to work, which coincidentally was the age at which Mary Phagan entered the workforce. And just as a sort of a context, this comes from a 1912 commission report it was a commission established to review the business practices in these factories, because this was, keep in mind, this is sort of the South was undergoing something of an industrialization process. The end of the battle is not yet for those girls who struggle on alone and unprotected with their more pressing financial problems. The greatest menace before her is man. The advances of men without even a spark of bravery or honor, who hunt as their unlawful prey this impoverished girl, this defenseless child of poverty, unprotected, unloved, and uncared for, as she is plunged into the swirling, seething stream of humanity. The advances of men who are so low they have lost even a sense of sportsmanship, and who seek as their game a tired, lonely, and destitute girl. She suffers and goes down and is finally sacrificed to a life of shame. But what of him? He escapes. It's not just, and this type of man should be severely punished. And the point of this is that in addition to child labor, those conditions created an environment of white slavery, prostitution of children, boys as well, mind you. And
well, they also employed a fair number of African Americans doing janitorial such jobs, security guard work.
We'll get to that, but the child labor was almost exclusively, if not entirely, white.
Yeah, I noticed that. It's a good point to make. It's kind of curious why that's the case.
There were absolutely blacks employed, for instance, at the National Pencil Company, and they will be a major part of the story that I'm about to tell. And yes, they were paid very little, and as you can imagine. But the children were...
Just
go ahead.
Put on my bow tie for a moment.
Oh, no.
Child labor.
No.
Just bear with me, dude. Child
We'll see.
labor in the context of a heavily agricultural society where you have endemic sharecropping, subsistence agriculture, and they're trying to industrialize their economy. The alternative to child labor in such an environment isn't you go to school, eventually you go to college, you go to Harvard, you become a EPA administrator or whatever. The alternative to working in the factory is you're busting your ass in the sun in a field.
Right.
So child labor per se, I mean, you should treat people with respect. Certainly you shouldn't be making children do dangerous work or work that's going to harm them in some way. And certainly you shouldn't be sexually exploiting them. It goes without saying. But employing, nimble fingers to, do intricate parts work is not morally problematic from first principles, in my view.
Right. And
Well, yeah.
I
Go ahead, Hans.
am on board with child labor. I mean, to what Hank is saying, that goes back to what? The agricultural revolution. So at least 10,000 years, if not more, of children working alongside their parents in agriculture or basic, very rudimentary trades.
I don't know, but I'm sure it goes back further than that to the hunter-gatherer days.
I mean, in a societal sense, though, is like as far back as that goes. And the U.S. didn't ban it until, I want to say 1938, like fair. It was like a labor standards legislation.
During
labor
the Depression?
Yeah,
Labor
Labor Standards Act or something like that.
Yeah, probably.
It was done mostly for political reasons at the federal level.
Yeah, but you could also argue it's for economic reasons too, because if there's a surplus of labor, you create a shortage by reducing the hours and number of people employed, and so then you do have that breadwinner who can actually support his own family, but can't have that. So
yeah, I mean, it had been banned in several states at that point, but I think from my recollection of this stuff from my my Lulberg years, it was declared unconstitutional at the federal level several times to try and reform or ban child labor, and then they finally got it passed.
Well, regardless of whether you could make a case for child labor or not, it was a pretty bleak situation for the poor daughters and sons of the South working in these prominently Jewish-owned factories. And I could, of course, offer a couple solutions for how we could have prevented that, but that's a digression. It would have involved expropriation. But regardless, Mary Phagan was one of these such girls. She left school at 10 to join to work in a Jewish sweatshop. And 3 years later, she was murdered. And she was I believe one of 5 children, and only so much. There was a book written in the 80s, interestingly enough, that is not endorsed by the ADL, that was written by her, I guess, great niece, who shares her name, Mary Phagan. The book's called The Murder of Little Mary Phagan. That's a pretty good book. And she worked in this. Her job was to screw the little metal pieces at the at the end of the pencil where the eraser goes. That was her job. She screwed those little metal pieces on. That's what she did. And it was of some that fact is of some significance when you get into the facts of the murder. And I will now do that. I should add too, we have some new donors, and I would like to thank my donors. And I would like to add that for this week's installment, some of the donors' money has gone to the Right and Honorable Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam, because they produced in 2016 a very good book on the subject. It was the third in their series on the secret relationship between blacks and Jews, which deals with Jewish involvement in the slave trade and in the plantation system, and disputes the various Jewish myths about their loving proclivities towards blacks, etc. And I have not read the first 2 volumes, but after reading the third, I have every interest in reading the first 2. So what I'm about to read comes from the Nation of Islam sponsored book investigating this incident. Because as you'll see, as we go on, you'll see why it is the blacks would have an interest in this, particularly the woke Negroes over at NOI. So this is NOI's account of the murder. I have various different sources and accounts, but this one's very clear and straightforward. So I'm going to read from this. Earlier that week, Mary had been laid off from her job operating a machine that attached erasers to pencils. The sheet brass that formed the metal bands that hold the erasers to the pencils had run out, leaving Mary without employment until the metal could be restocked. Frank met Mary in his office shortly after noon. I should add, this is on Confederate Memorial Day, so the factory was closed. It was a Saturday, which, interestingly enough, Saturday.
The Sabbath.
The Sabbath. And so Mary was on her way to go celebrate. I don't know if I've never been in the South for Confederate Memorial Day. I don't know if it's still a big thing there. I would hope it is.
I don't think it is anymore.
That's too bad.
Could be
but
wrong.
Back then it very much was. Big deal. Parades and everything. And Mary was looking forward to go have fun with her friends. And, but instead she was murdered by
at the time, it was approximately the same amount of time for us to the Vietnam War to the Civil War for them.
Right, that's a good point.
It's roughly the same time frame in 1913.
Yeah, there are plenty of surviving veterans and everything. So she goes to Frank. She wants her pay to go off and enjoy the festivities. And she had asked him if expected shipment of metal had arrived. And she was effectively asking him whether she could come back to work on Monday. To which Frank replied, "I don't know." And then from here is where the lies and the controversy begins, because prosecutors convinced the jury that Frank's ambiguous answer, "I don't know," was in reality a ploy designed to lure Mary down the hall and into the secluded back storage room, ostensibly to see whether the metal shipment had arrived. Frank's attorneys, of course, would later dispute this, claiming that he answered with a firm no. But the detective who first testified to Frank's uncertain reply had been hired by Frank himself. And so what happens next? Frank closed the door behind when they entered the metal room, and he lustfully forced himself upon her. She resisted, and in the struggle, Frank struck Mary in the face, causing her to fall backward and hit her head against the steel handle of one of the machines. The impact gouged the back of her head and knocked her unconscious, at which point the fearful Jewish coward decided to strangle her to death with a cord. And this cord was wrapped so tightly, it was embedded in her neck, and Undertaker later removed the body from the factory. When they saw this, and it was... Prosecutors say that a panicked Leo Frank then summoned the factory's black janitor, or sweeper, as you'll see him elsewhere referred to, James Conley, and swore him to secrecy and ordered him to help move the body to the basement. So here you have the Negro and the Jew carrying the body to the elevator and then getting to the basement, drag it across the dirt floor to its final resting place near a trash pile by the furnace. Both men then returned to Frank's second floor office, where he gave Conley a pad of paper and ordered him to write as he dictated. And Conley wrote note after note, but the efforts of the barely literate janitor were unable to satisfy his agitated boss. A total of 4 notes were written, all to appear as if they were scrawled by the dying girl herself, fingering the assailant, a black man. Frank then ordered Conley to return later that day to burn the girl's remains in the basement furnace, promising him cash reward, which I believe is like $200. And
so
threatened.
This is the narrative put forward by the janitor, I assume. Or
yeah, yes. Well, here's what happens. Conley doesn't come back. Okay, like the idea was that he would come back later to burn the body, and he doesn't come.
Why not?
So, he didn't. It's somewhat ambiguous. He didn't want to really be party to it. I think at the end of the day, this is guy. Keep in mind, like, this is his master, so to speak. Because he does what he's told, but he didn't feel quite right about burning this girl's corpse. I think at the end of the day, it can be.
Well, didn't he write his own confession on that pad of paper?
No, he wrote an accusation fingering a tall black.
Another black. Was that Newt?
The other black employee was Newt Lee, the night watchman, and that was who the notes were meant to implicate. Now, the final notes were likely written by Frank himself, using those notes of Connolly as a template. And much of the disputes around the case comes down to these. The notes are a very big piece of evidence and a very much contested thing, because ultimately what people on the side of truth would say is that it's very clear that Frank's attempts to imitate the subliterate Negro fell short, right? He's trying to mimic what a barely literate Negro would write.
I would like us to pause at this point and contemplate the state of mind of a black janitor. Your boss grabs you off from whatever you're doing, shows you a corpse, and asks you to write a series of notes saying the black guy did it.
Yeah, exactly. Correct.
And then try to throw her corpse into the oven.
Yes.
I don't know what could have possibly been going through his mind. I'm almost incredulous that, at the first point at which somebody is like, hey, could you write a note saying the black guy did it? One would think he would be running the fuck away, but perhaps
he wasn't quite literate enough to know what he was like. He didn't exactly know what he was writing. He just wrote what he was told. But the thing is that the Frankists, the liars who claim that Frank was not the murderer, to this day, they implicate Connolly himself.
Well, they claim he was very capable of saying the word "did" rather than "done" in his speech, and they cite the court transcripts.
Like when he wrote "Night Watchman," it came to "Night Witch." But to stay on the point there, it's the notes were designed to implicate the Night Watchman, not Connolly. Yet the people writing to exonerate Frank today, essentially they claim that what happened here was that when Mary left with her pay, the sweeper, Jim Connolly, ambushes her, drags her into the basement, and murders her for money. Okay? And
I thought he was just raping her. And then
no, they don't claim that. No, they claim that it was for money. However, during the trial, we're going to get into this, but during the trial, the question of rape was central to the trial. The trial was for murder, and I'm not going to really get into the forensics around like the autopsy with the vagina and stuff. It's not exactly important, to be honest. If we had more time, I guess we could get into that. But the key point to understand here is that the disputes over the murder is where it was committed. The truth is that the murder was committed in the metal room, which, by the way, is right by Frank's office. Okay, and similarly,
was there any evidence for
Frank's office?
The murder taking place in that room?
Yes. There was hair on the metal handle in the metal. There's plenty of evidence. There's blood. It was very clear that the murder took place there.
Okay.
There was the idea was that he dragged him by himself down to the basement, which there's other problems there too, because Connolly did not have access to the elevator key, which would have been necessary to move her down to the basement.
Okay, now maybe this is the right time. It's a little bit awkward to ask this at any point, but did he defecate in the elevator shaft? I mean, it's just such an odd
They do claim that
occurrence. Well, yeah, but it's not just, I don't know who you mean by they, but I think the detectives who went down there smelled it too.
Oh, there was feces in the elevator shaft, but the likely origin of that was that it was Mary's feces from being strangled.
Okay. Well,
that's the thing.
Not sure, but okay.
Yeah. No, that's a well-known physiological reaction. Once the central nervous shuts down, all the various muscles constricting things, holding things in, also release.
Even from a small child. I mean, well, she's not. I guess she's middle-sized, but
13 at this point.
Right. Right.
So at this point, like this occurred. The murder. It's not disputed that the murder occurred around the early noon. So before 12:30. Likely, I believe between like 12:10 is when it becomes significant. When there's another girl employee who provides some very crucial testimony later. But timeline of events. So this murder took place. Frank ambushes this girl, tries to rape her, or tries to. There's some. I will add. There's some speculation that maybe she was, as I mentioned, white slavery and stuff earlier. We'll get into what Frank was doing with his factory girls. But this was a system that he had set up. And Conley, for instance, was complicit in the system. Conley would stand lookout for Frank when he would take these girls for a chat. Gonna have a nice chat with these little girls.
Did he testify to that in court?
Conley did, yes. He did testify to that in court. And so at this point, at 1:10, after Conley leaves, he's promised to come back. Frank goes home for lunch because it's his usual schedule. He wants to stick to it. Comes back at 3. Conley's not there, and he fails to incinerate the body himself. And that's when the cryptic notes are left down by the incinerator. Now at 4 o'clock, another black employee, Newt Lee.
But why doesn't Frank just do it?
Too much of a pussy. That's my reading. That's my reading.
Right.
Too weak is another one.
Also, if you're
keep in mind, this guy's
worried
like
about being discovered transiting the body, that could also cause some apprehension.
Yeah, well, I guess he didn't know that Conley didn't do the job, so he assumed.
No, well, he was. Exactly. He comes back at a later time. Well, Conley.
Well, the detectives show up to his home.
Okay, but this is later. We're jumping ahead. 4 o'clock. The Newt Lee arrives to work his overnight shift, and he had been there for about 3 weeks, and this is the first time he encountered a locked front door. And Lee uses his key to pass through, but then Frank rushes down from his office to inform Lee that he didn't need him until 6 o'clock, and Lee asked, if he could stay in the factory to rest for the next 2 hours. Even though the factory was completely empty, Frank refuses his request and sends him away, and tells him, go have a good time. I think he gives them some money too. And then next you have a white employee, James Gant, arrives unexpectedly to ask to retrieve some shoes he had left in the factory. Now this is significant. Gant was the paymaster, and he was fired 2 weeks before. And one of the explanations for this is Gant was potentially a suitor for Mary. They got on well, and there was something there maybe. I doubt he was having sex with her. But he was potentially a suitor. He wasn't her boyfriend or anything. But that would also explain why he was fired. He was fired. Frank's explanation for why he was fired was that he was short $1 or something. But another explanation.
I thought you meant he was too short, like height.
No, short. He was like the payment. Yeah, he did something with the money. I forget, and he wanted to get him out of the way because a big thing we'll get to when the police first show up. Frank denies knowing Mary Phagan, and this is a lie. And many people can testify to the fact that this is a lie. There's a lot of evidence that this is a lie, and it's actually Frank himself incriminates himself on that lie very quickly in short order. But we'll get there. So here's Gant arriving. And this is actually kind of darkly funny what happens here. He has to retrieve some shoes that he had left at the factory. And Frank tells him, no, I threw out your shoes, because he described the shoes or whatever. It's like, Frank's like, no, I threw them out. And he's like, yeah, but I had 2 pairs of shoes, so let me get the other ones.
Oh, no.
And so he allows him into the factory, but he has Lee escort him, like, make sure that he watches him very closely. And then
Lee is the one who discovers the body. Same person?
Eventually. Not yet, though.
I got you. Just want to put those together.
And Gant, by the way, finds both pairs of shoes.
Okay. Did this come out in court? This detail?
Oh, yeah, dude. Yeah. This, we're going to get to there, but keep in mind, this is the longest and most expensive trial in Georgia state history.
Jeez.
And so the court documents on this are extensive. And the things how much was written afterwards, and we'll get there. So at this point, you have around an hour after this, at 7 p.m., Frank calls Lee to the factory and asks if everything was all right, something he had not done before. And he later claims, of course, that he called to make sure that Gant had left, but Lee testifies later that Frank did not ask about Gant. So at 3 a.m. on Sunday morning, Lee's making his hourly rounds, and while in the basement, he notices a strange heap in the distance that appeared to be a body. First, he thought some coworkers had played a trick on him, but then he realizes that this is the body of a dead white girl. And you can imagine this, like, what's going through this guy's head. It's like he's discovering a dead white corpse, and this can't end well for him. So he calls Frank immediately, and Frank doesn't answer. And neither of the other 4 people who lived at Frank's home answered. Because keep in mind, he lived with his Seligs, his in-laws. And so then he calls the police, and they arrive at the factory, and then the investigators find the body, and then they see that it was just covered in dirt because it was dragged across the basement floor. They find the notes, and of course, they immediately arrest Newtley. I mean, you have a black standing over. Yeah, exactly. A black standing over a dead white girl. And after this, they then some more information. The lead's information around Gant and everything. They arrest Gant as well. And in addition, they also arrest a friend of Mary's named Arthur Mullinax, who's a streetcar operator. And they also arrest the 19-year-old black elevator operator named Gordon Bailey.
I just have a procedural question. When a murder like this is discovered and the arrests are made, since the detectives or the police officers are so fresh on the case, do they have probable cause to arrest people? I mean, do they have to get warrants? Maybe Hank.
This was not really a concern in 1913 Georgia.
Correct.
It kind of bear in mind, this is pre-Warren Court, so it wasn't even the case as a matter of federal law that you had all of these notions of the incorporation of the Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendments into state law. I don't think that a lot of that happened on the federal level. So basically, no federal court was going to tell some Georgia state employee he couldn't round up the usual suspects. And as a matter of practical Georgia state law, I'm sure that was also the case.
And yes, exactly. And so they go 7 a.m, then they go talk to Frank, who is he goes to the station, but he's not arrested until 2 days later. And this comes up later, but they very much downplayed his arrest, the papers and everything. It was, he was detained. We'll see in the bullshit Jewish history of this and all that is this idea that there was like this anti-Semitism or something going on, blah, 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 blah. The fact of the matter is that the papers and people, everyone was looking for a black. Is what they assumed. And we'll see what some of these people had to say. But let's see what happens when Frank is arrested, or at least when he is first talked to by the police. He, of course, immediately denies knowing Mary. They appear at his door early Sunday morning to inform him of the crime, and he was very standoffish and argumentative, insisting that he had a cup of coffee before he would accompany them to the crime scene.
He was described as being very nervous and anxious.
Yes, very much so. He had not answered early morning phone calls from the night watchman, as I mentioned, or 2 phone calls from the police who had called as well. And it was his bathrobed wife he sent to answer the door, even though he was fully clothed. The police at the scene described Frank as, yes, extremely nervous, quivering, overwrought, and pale. According to one officer at the scene, Frank did not even ask what had occurred. I didn't tell him what had happened, and he didn't ask me, policeman said. Frank was brought to the pencil factory, where he appeared so nervous that he could not operate the elevator to the basement. The factory personnel manager, Envy Darley, had to take the controls and accomplish the simple task. Policemen detailed to watch the factory from the street reported that Frank came to the window many times, nervously rubbing his hands. Sorry, it's funny. This behavior contrasts noticeably with that of the night watchman, Lee.
Maybe they just get cold a lot.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Cold-blooded.
No one's ever proposed that maybe they have chronic hypothermia or something like that.
Makes you wonder.
Yeah.
Reptiles also have cold blood, but that's just a side note.
This is contrasted with like his nervousness, his anxiety, his behavior. It's contrasting. The police observed this, and the night watchman, the black man, Newt Lee, a Nation of Islam is quick to remind us that just that year were 62 lynchings of blacks. Okay, so he had every reason to be terrified, yet he's calmly assisting, cooperating with the police, whereas Frank is the one who's behaving like a nervous Nelly. Okay, so in addition to this, Frank was taken down to the morgue to identify the body, and this is something else he talked about a lot. He refused to look at the corpse when the undertaker pulled back the curtain concealing her. And Newt Lee had reported that the gas light in the basement had been turned down to its lowest level, but that he had left it burning bright the night before, and it was suspected that murderer did this to conceal the victim from the night watchman so that he'd come back and dispose of the body, even though even though he was not a suspect and not this is where it just starts to get cartoonish. Okay, like he wasn't at this point charged with the crime. This is because, as I said, he was arrested 2 days later. Immediately after his dealings with the police, he hires Georgia's most celebrated lawyer, Luther Rosser, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Right. The police, of course, saw this as extremely suspicious. So the Pinkerton, this becomes a big issue throughout the case. Like the detective agents, the Pinkerton Detective Agency, as well as later the so-called Burns Detective Agency, were present throughout. There's lots of shady stuff happening throughout this. And there were people, for instance, there was a friend of Mary Phagan's named George Epps, who had testified that Phagan was afraid of Frank because he had winked, flirted, and made inappropriate sexual advances towards her. And 2 imposters posing as Pinkerton detective agents had interviewed George Epps, as well as Phagan's mother, looking for character on. And what you'll see is that, in the background, you had all this. I'll get into the dynamics of the money, but you had this all-star law team that Frank hired, and the money came actually from the Montags, the owners of the pencil company. That it was, familial relations to Frank, and they brought to bear. They had their own little investigations going on, but the irony of this is these people ended up testifying one way or another, testifying incriminating information about Frank to the people whom he had hired. So where we get into the trial itself, and this is where the circus really begins, because here you have the claims of the ADL and SPLC and these Jewish historians that there was this anti-Semitism that had motivated this hysterical, insane anti-Semitism. Famously, Dinnerstein, who's really one of the most egregious and just absolutely revolting Jewish propagandists on the issue. This is a guy who said that the murder of Mary Phagan was a tragedy, but the lynching of Leo Frank was an even greater tragedy. And this is really this issue really just lays to bear the dynamics and race relations in the South and things that are real only in the minds
I just don't even understand that comment. I mean, you have a grown man and you have a little girl who's horribly murdered like that, and you have a guy who was convicted of a crime who then gets lynched after his sentence is commuted. How the hell is that a worse crime than having a little girl murdered? It just makes no sense.
It happened to a Jew. That's why it's worse.
Yeah, I know, but this is the sort of stuff that people need to push back with.
It's not clear to me that Atlanta in 1913 was even particularly anti-Semitic.
Oh no, okay. If anything, it was philo-Semitic.
Yeah, the reputation is that the Confederacy had Benjamin.
Yes, Judah P. Benjamin.
Was. Yes, Judah Benjamin as their Secretary of Treasury. They were small Sephardic Jewish, not Ashkenazi Jewish communities, kind of dotted throughout the South that didn't really seem to get into any trouble. And I can't think of any sort of organized anti-Semitic means of the same way that you saw, for instance, anti-Catholic campaigns.
There was no such thing. In fact, the Jews will say that prior to the lynching of Leo Frank in 1915, the most significant example of American anti-Semitism, and this is not just the South, American anti-Semitism, was an episode that occurred 38 years earlier in 1877 when a powerful Jewish banker named Joseph Seligman was denied accommodations at an elite vacation resort in upstate New York.
LOL.
I mean, and so I have, in 2009, there was an ADL-approved PBS documentary called The People versus Leo Frank. And I have the teacher's handbook to that. And in this handbook, they attempt to set the context of anti-Semitism.
Wait, so this is given to schools to show to their class, and there's a handbook.
Yes.
There's literally a instruction manual for how to explain this.
Correct.
And
this is extremely common for a lot of PBS documentaries when their core audience is basically, their real customer is the teacher who wants kind of a low effort day of let's watch a movie, kids, and talk about it afterwards.
Movie Friday
and that
kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And that often they will bundle the sort of curriculum that they want attached to that with the movie, so you don't have to do your own, complex thematic analysis or whatever.
Right. And this is how. So they set the scene. In the quoting from that handbook, they say the notion of perverted Jewish man lusting after innocent Christian children was planted in the minds of jurors and carried to the public through sensational newspaper editorials. But of course, not a single article or editorial suggested anything of the sort.
A month after, like the way that Jews seem to, and the American Jewish community seems to perceive any slight against them. Like in my mind, the United States has always been kind of a hurt box. Like you show up here, no matter where you're from, and you get bounced on, you get made fun of, you get bullied a little, and if you adapt and you do well and you behave, eventually the bullying stops. Like the bullying worked really well,
or it just
with
becomes
a lot of
a hilarious joke that everybody participates in, like
right, like the bullying
our, esteemed Irish community.
Yeah, the bullying worked really well against the Irish and the Italians and the Polish and some others. Like it crafted them into pretty nominally right wing ethnic groups within the United States. But this case just, it highlights, I guess, what it was at the time and what it is to these people now. It's just the, oh God, the decades of anti-Semitism in America. Like, well, maybe people just don't like you, and you just have to get used to that.
The anti-Semitism will continue until integration improves.
Right.
Well, and as Abe Foxman himself says, America was a much different place in 1913 compared to Europe. Jews here lived far more secure and stable lives, but stereotypes and name calling were still common. Oh God, these mean words.
Yeah, Nick, we can't have these stereotypes.
Nick, you said before that the reporting or the description of Jews as being kind of perverted was not done. From my understanding, there was a paper run by a guy named Watson who was calling...
I'll get into Tom Watson. But the first thing I'll say about Tom Watson is that Tom Watson did not write about the case until the trial had concluded.
I see. That makes sense.
Okay. Tom Watson, by the way, is the single greatest source on this. He wrote extensively and very well. He's something almost like a Mencken. I'll be reading from some of Tom Watson, but he provides a very good summary. But he did not involve himself into the case until after. When the appeals process started, he became involved. But the actual trial proper, he was not involved in.
At what point did Hearst and the New York Times insert themselves into this?
I'll get into during the trial. They inserted themselves during the trial.
I think that's an important point to make because they were very pro-Frank.
A month after the Georgian, which was a Hearst-owned paper, was aggressively editorializing an exoneration of Frank. Month after the murder. And Frank's Jewishness, by the way, was not mentioned by the prosecution. The only insertion of his Jewishness into the trial was by Frank's defenders and his B'nai B'rith Association. Remember, he was the president of the Atlanta chapter. And only then it was a means of reinforcing his integrity and character in the public mind. Whereas the Negroes, the entire defense of the case was the nigger did it. Okay? Seriously, here's Frank's defense attorney, Reuben Arnold. It's a nigger crime, gentlemen. It's a nigger crime. Why go further than this black wretch there by the elevator shaft, fired with liquor, fired with lust, and crazy for money? Why? They rob and ravish every day in the most peculiar and shocking way. But this man's race, pointing to Frank, don't kill. They are not a violent race. Some of them may be immoral, but they go no further than that. I want to call your attention later to the class of their witnesses and the class of ours. The crime isn't an act of civilized man. It's a crime of a cannibal, a man-eater. The crime is the hideous act of a Negro who would ravish a 10-year-old girl the same as he would ravish a woman of years. It isn't a white man's crime. It is a low, savage beast.
It's funny that they're calling him a white man. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually, and it's true in the context of the Jim Crow South, because as Nation of Islam is quick to point out, the Jews were instrumental in the slavery system, in the plantation system.
Right. I want to bring up that apparently Adolf Ochs.
Yeah, I'll get into Ochs, but you can go ahead.
New York Times and Albert Lasker.
Yes.
The man behind American advertising.
Yes, he's some called the father of modern advertising. Correct.
Yeah, from I think he was from Chicago.
Lasker is jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll just get into it now. So Lasker, with the help of Jews like the Sears magnate Julius Rosenwald and none other than Wall Street Bolshevik financier Jacob Schiff, many prominent Jews they hopped on this, and Lasker was this. He was the money man, okay, and he was the money man and the advertising sort of coordinator in a certain sense. And you'll see the Burns Detective Agency was sort of a conduit for Lasker's money. But yeah, he was the head of the firm is Lord and Thomas, which was at the time the most profitable advertising agency in the world. And they spent a lot of time repackaging in the store. They framed it in the context of this. You took this, alleged convicted child rapist and murderer to that of the innocent Jew sufferer of an anti-Semitic mob. And he was involved. His products, he was Lucky Strikes, Chanel perfume, Kotex napkins, Quaker Roads, Kleenex, Sun-Kissed oranges, Goodyear tires, and Budweiser.
The specific invocation of, I don't know what to call this specifically black, anti-black racism, race baiting, I guess we call it, by the Frank defense, that is interesting to me because it takes all of the wind out of the sails of the narrative, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
And I have to imagine that at that time and place, the black dude did it as the defense to a murder that was legitimately committed by a white or what have you. That would not have been the first time somebody tried to pin it on a black dude.
No, but you know what it was? The first time ever, the star witness and his testimony was accepted against a white man in court.
Yeah, I mean, I would guess that probably in a lot of cases, because stereotypes about the Southern administration of justice aside, you do have an interest in punishing the party responsible and not just finding a scapegoat. So, I mean, there's going to be a ton of cases where you have a dead white girl, it was her boyfriend or whatever that did it. He tries to pin it on a black guy, and everybody knows exactly what's going on, and the right person gets the chair.
And probably a little more frequent than some people want to admit, cases of white women having sex with Negroes, and then blaming
it was rape, etc.
After they got found out.
Well, that there may very well be reasons for local areas to sort of enforce their own moral code. That even if they're into you, you shouldn't be into them. Because look what happened to poor Dwayne over here.
Right. Well, so just since Hans mentioned Lasker, I want to just give two quotes by Lasker. So here's Lasker on the Jews. This is what Lasker has to say about God's chosen people. The Jews are a superior people. I have a hard time hiding that. I feel we should be patient with non-Jews. I deeply believe that no Christian civilization can last that remove from it the Jews. That is the Jew that brings them the pollen. Okay. And you kind of wonder what this guy, he's just mobilizing this big northern coalition, advertising and money to defend Frank. He surely must believe that Frank was an innocent Jew, right? It was very hard for us to be fair to him. He, Frank, impressed us as a sexual pervert. Now, he may not have been, or rather homosexual or something like that. Okay? Get it yet, guys? So let's
that's everyone kind of knew.
That's rather forthright there. He struck me as kind of a deviant.
Yeah. So let's mention two other power players in the coalition. You have Louise Marshall, who was the head of the American Jewish Committee, which had been formed in 1906 to represent the interests of wealthy assimilated German American Jews. And though Frank shared their status and heritage, the group first shied away from him, not wanting to, quote, be perceived of championing the cause of a Jew convicted of a crime. But upon reflection and much lobbying, the AJC, American Jewish Committee, board members overcame their apprehensions and donated money, time, and talent to Frank's cause and its growing symbolic significance to American Jews. The AJC was founded and led by attorney Louis Marshall of the Wall Street firm Guggenheimer, Untermeyer, and Marshall, who is considered by many, including himself, to be the most, I'm reading here from the Nation of Islam, many, including himself, the most prominent Jew in America. A so-called court Jew, privileged and well-regarded, Marshall earned back stairway access to the inner sanctums of the powerful, including President Wilson and the Justice of the Supreme Court.
Right.
He
and
considered
this goes to some quote that Frank, I guess, told to Colney, which is, "Why should I hang? I got wealthy people in Brooklyn."
That's right.
You know,
he did say it. And wait, let me for a second, Hank. Let me finish on a few minutes on Marshall. Yeah. He considered himself the spokesman for the citizens of the Jewish faith, and he's incentivized and prodding by Albert Lasker. Marshall, as a lead attorney organizer, engineered the legal strategy of the Frank case as it worked its way through the appeals process up to the United States Supreme Court.
Yeah. So I put on my libertarian bow tie earlier. I'm going to take that bow tie off and I'm going to put on my Nation of Islam bow tie.
Finally.
And I'm going to say that the kind of extremely woke interpretation of this series of events is that, white supremacy is so pervasive that, these whites are able just to go around raping and murdering innocent children with no repercussions to themselves, solely kind of placing the onus upon the angelic, poor, innocent black man that's never actually involved in any sort of tomfoolery even. And that really this is an attempt by the Jewish community to fully assume their white privilege and to engage in the great white American pastime of getting away with murder and pinning it on the black dude.
Yes, but you would be surprised at how respectful this work was. Yeah, there's a lot of that whole so-called, well, they don't say so-called Jew, but there is this equivocation between they see Jews as whites, full stop. However, they do draw a secondary distinction between white Jews and white Gentiles. And there is a fairly respectful attitude towards, especially impressive considering that they're going through this. I mean, the book provides these just really exhaustive accounts of anti-black lynchings, right, like massacres and stuff. So considering where they're coming from, looking at it, their people's perspective, is really impressed upon me how respectful they chose to be to people who they considered their racial enemies on one level.
Do you know who and why at the Nation of Islam wrote that pamphlet, or is it?
It's not a pamphlet. It's a very exhaustive book and very thoroughly sourced.
Was he a lawyer? What's his background? What's his motivation?
It's not a single author. It's written by the research group of the Nation of Islam.
Oh, interesting.
And as I said earlier, it's a third in a series of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, published 2016.
See, I like how they have their own institutions. I think that's the way to go. Just, hey, we're going to have our own thing.
This is by far the greatest book I've ever read written by blacks. It really made me understand where they're coming from in a big way, because while the Jewish claims of anti-Semitism are completely unfounded. Oh, I forgot to mention too, in that ADL handbook. So just as an aside, the setting the scene for anti-Semitism. Wait,
PBS or ADL handbook?
One and the same. It's the handbook that goes with the PBS document.
It's not technically the same, but I know what you mean.
Well,
just wanted to get the record.
It's the ADL handbook that is to be given to teachers' handbook. to be given accompanying the PBS film, 2009 PBS film. And in it, they provide these two images of that are supposed to. It's really ironic too, because if you see, you guys can pull it up. It says, part says even considering the source, and it shows you this picture. And for our YouTube, we'll throw it up here on the YouTube video. But it's you'll see a picture of a sign that says Christians only, no Jews. And then you'll have this it's that hotel thing I mentioned earlier. They have some picture of something related to that up in New York. And the sign that sign, it's from fucking Canada. Okay? So like
whoops.
It's whoops. And it even says, like, that's so funny. It says, like, considering the source. Yeah, I'm considering the source. And the source is you're a lying Jew is the source. And so yes, they completely failed to establish any kind of Southern anti-Semitism. And in fact, it's really easy to see this from the perspective of the people who were, in fact, on the end of institutional systemic racism and oppression. It is true. Now, of course, that's the only way to deal with blacks if you're integrated into a society. Sadly, it's true. There's no getting around that. I will say that, but it doesn't make it just what happened to these guys. It doesn't make it just that these guys would just be rounded up when whoever accuses them of whatever. It's kind of the inverse. It's so bizarre considering how it works today. It's the complete inverse. But it's reading about it from the black perspective. It's very interesting because the Jews cry foul. They cry anti-Semitism. And meanwhile, their icon of the American Holocaust, or rather the American Dreyfus Affair, is probably.
Hey, Nick, maybe you should suggest to the Nation of Islam that they write a teacher's pamphlet to the video that they will soon to produce for the children of America.
Well, this book kind of serves as that. They address the PBS. This, as I said, this was written in 2016, so they do at various points address that 2009 PBS documentary. But it just you kind of got me off track there for a second. So let's a few notes on Marshall too. While we're on Louis Marshall, again, the head of the American Jewish Committee. So Marshall was instrumental in the creation of this myth of this anti-Semitic mobs, so he claimed to the highest court, that is when they continue to appeal this up to the Supreme Court, that the mob was hostile to him and they intimidated the court, and the jury were influenced by some anti-Semitic mob, and this is untrue. And they, as you see in that 2009 work, as well as in the what is considered by the ADL to be the definitive treatment of this Steve Oney's work with this fucking ridiculous melodramatic title, "And the Dead Shall Rise." And they actually omit these claims that were prominent. As you see, there's an ever-shifting narrative, but they omit these claims that were prominent in the 60s and before that. There was this chant at the courtroom, inside the courtroom, no less: "Hang the Jew or we'll hang you." Right? And this is in the meanwhile, like, just relentless anti-black using they refer to the Negro Jim Conley and the Negro Newt Lee, but they never refer to Leo Frank as the Jew Leo Frank. Doesn't happen. Okay, so in fact, Frank pushed forward individuals that had claimed to witness this mob-like behavior, right? And they claims. Reading from Nation of Islam, examination of those claims, however, finds that those supposed mobs were described in very unmob-like terms, as having variously applauded, hurrahed, whispered, shouted, and cheered, not terms used to characterize bloodthirsty, lynch-ready, anti-Semitic rioters. And curiously, many of those witnesses claiming to have freely intermingled with the pogromic mobs of anti-Semites had Jewish surnames like Hazan, Lipschitz, Burstein, Rosinski, Sherman, and in fact, B.S. Lipschitz said that he was mingling with the crowd, not the mob, but the crowd, which is defined as merely a large number of persons gathered together.
Fun fact, Ralph Lauren changed his name from Ralph something like Lifshitz to Lauren. Probably
as pointed out very ably by Donald Trump on his Twitter feed several years ago.
No way.
Really? Okay. Interesting, guys. So he's describing this like mingled, and then none of the voluntarily mingling witnesses reported being threatened, attacked, lynched, or even insulted for their Jewishness, and none were ever known to have faced any form of retaliation for signing their names to such treasonous claims in the heart of Jim Crow, Georgia. It's difficult to imagine that a Jew in such an environment of, quote, mobbish anti-Semitism could be moved, as Frank's mother was, to curse the prosecutor in open court, calling him a Gentile dog, which happened, mind you, before getting up and walking out of the courtroom into the public street. She wasn't afraid for her life. Frank's mother walks in the courtroom. It's alternatively, sometimes it's recorded as Christian dog. So she refers to prosecutor Hugh M. Dorsey as a Gentile dog or as a Christian dog. She just walks right out. No, she didn't fear. Nobody did anything to her, but she comes in with this anti-Christian, anti-white invective. And she even came back the next day. So it was the Jewish woman's bigoted utterance that introduced Frank religion into the trial. At one point during the trial, dozens of Jewish character witnesses from all over the United States came to the Georgia court. They rounded up all these Jews to come testify, etc. So the third we have, so there's the two power players we've established, so the money man advertiser Albert Lasker, and then the American Jewish Committee lawyer who helps sort of design the strategies, Louis Marshall. The third in this sort of triumvirate of Jewish muscle, which was as Hans mentioned earlier, Adolph Ochs, who was the
New York Times
owner of the New York Times. Yeah. So he was contacted by Louis Marshall, and he initially had some squeamishness, and he didn't really want to get involved. But then, as Dinerstein framed it, to employ his newspaper, he eventually agreed to, quote, employ his newspaper as a weapon in the fight to exonerate Frank. And here's how Albert Lasker remembers it. Ochs said, "So far as calling the nation's attention to it, you leave that to me. I'm sending my best man down there." And the New York Times ran the only murder crusade it ever ran on that. They ran as much beginning of the week as 5 pages a day, and page after page and day for months and months and months. One author characterizes Ochs' involvement not as a coverage, but as an obsession. And Lasker later verified that Ochs went in it as the spirit of a crusader, and the whole nation took it up. In December 1914 alone, Ochs printed 33 articles and 5 editorials on the case. So you have a big New York Times muscle coming down. And this later plays into a dynamic that Tom, we'll get to Watson, but much more important than a Jewish Gentile. Watson does highlight Jewish Gentile dynamics, but Jews became more of a proxy for Northern power. The reason Jews would be resented was not for some kind of racial or religious anti-Semitism. If anything, the attitudes in that respect were philo-Semitic. But for a resentment, I mean, Frank himself was a carpetbagger. Right? I mean, though born in Texas, I mean, he came down from birth. He grew up in New York. He was 3 months old when he left Texas, and he comes down to Georgia. The dynamics of prejudice were justly seen as Northern influence on a matter of a Georgian girl being murdered. And these people coming down, well, what do they want? They want to exonerate their fellow Jew. And they're going to spend all the money they can, and they're going to manipulate and plan evidence and even attempt to murder people, which is what happened. So just a few notes on the New York Times and how they describe Conley. So again, remembering the context of anti-Semitism, that's interesting. ADL. So what did your guy have to say about Conley? How was Conley described? Well, here's some quotes from the New York Times in their description on Conley. a wretched, degenerate Negro, a semi-intoxicated, lustful, improvident, impunctuous Negro, a drunken degenerate, a treacherous Negro, a drunken, obscene Negro jailbird, a lying, licentious Negro jailbird, an unmoral wretch.
But was he an anti-Semite?
Who? The Negro?
Yeah.
That was never an accusation.
That's the worst accusation.
Yeah, but it was never, the appeal was to the Southern peoples, to the Georgian, the people of Atlanta.
I get it.
Yeah, I get you.
Cool.
So there you have it. Those are the three big power players coming in to influence this trial. And let's see. Oh, let me say something. A few other things. So, in the context of anti-Semitism, so keep in mind, 4 Gentiles that I mentioned earlier were arrested before Frank. The detectives from 2 private detective agencies that Frank himself had hired stated openly before the trial that they believed Frank to be guilty of murder. Some of the stuff came out later, but there you have it. And you'll see the ADL is obsessed with this idea that, like, as I said in my ADL approved introduction, that like Jews fled Atlanta and they were, it was going to be another show or whatever. They ADL fixates on this idea that there was a boycott of Jewish businesses, when in fact, if anything, there was an appeal to boycott Jewish businesses in response to Jewish boycotts of Georgian businesses. However, it failed to attract support. Didn't happen. Lie. So there you have it. Oh, also, I should add that when they're trying to describe like anti-Jew incidents and stuff afterwards, the only incident that happened was actually a Jew attacking a Jew shop owner. A guy came in and showed a picture of Frank's lynching, and the Jew attacked him. And similarly, there were Jews coming into the jail to intimidate Conley. Frank himself was given a luxurious imprisonment. Like, he had empty cells next to him, was completely comfortable, etc. Conley was actually deprived of being able to bathe for a while. Eventually, they let him bathe, and defense used that as like that's somehow incriminating. It's like you let the guy bathe, and that's terrible. It's really not possible to overstate the degree of anti-Black racism. It's kind of ironic using that word, because as we know that where that word comes from, but just leave it there. Like, you cannot overstate how thoroughly racist against Blacks or attempt to impugn the character, because Conley was a key witness here, and he survived. People were, they sent him through hell. They kept trying to trip him up on his story, because he confessed to it all. First, he lied to Frank out of fear of Frank, and then out of fear of what could happen to him otherwise, he just told the truth, and his story held up.
But he lied to the police, though.
Yes, he did. Initially, yes. And he admits to that.
Well, they forced him to, because it was... well,
yeah.
They showed him proof that he had lied. So
at
that point, there's no point in further incriminating yourself.
Yes, and he... A key point with respect to Conley's test, like, Frank refused to confront him. Okay, like, here you have a white man in Jim Crow South being accused by a Negro of being a murderer, and Frank refused to confront him, just like Frank refused to be examined or cross-examined at his trial. And so when Conley testified to things, for instance, like serving as lookout for Frank's predatory exploitation of the white little girls who worked there, the defense refused to challenge this because it would have required cross-examination. And Frank was not willing to submit to that. Similarly, in the early part of his arrest, he was like brought into a cell with Conley. The cops were like, "Okay, you're gonna get this nigger to tell us everything he knows," and Frank just goes. Frank doesn't even end up saying it. They just have like a chat. It's ridiculous, really. Like, they attempt to impugn him, the character and testimony of Conley, by the fact that he's black.
Well, and it's also, let's remember the context here. It's going to be super common for the first story that a black dude apprehended by the police in Georgia in 1913 for the murder of a white girl. God only knows what the fuck he's going to say, because he's desperately trying to avoid hanging. Whether or not he did anything, and like, honestly, regardless of the underlying circumstances there.
And they want us to believe that this guy fooled the best legal minds in the state. Like, he's some kind of Negro mastermind. This subliterate Negro was the mastermind behind this. It strains all credulity. And so here you have the most egregious. I referenced this in my ADL approved intro, but here you have the most absolutely revolting and Jewish statement of them all. Here's Leonard Dinerstein speaking about this dynamic. It's evident in the widespread acceptance of Negro Jim Conley's testimony. Anti-Semitism in Atlanta is evident in the widespread acceptance of Negro Jim Conley's testimony. I mean, just think about that for a second. The fact that you believe the black proves that you hate that you're an anti-Semite. I mean, and this is where they really struggle in the current year with trying to explain.
So are they all racist then? Are they all black haters because they believe Frank's story? I mean, the logic goes both ways. The hypocrisy is what I can't stand about this shit.
They are, of course, they're racist.
Yeah, but see, could you accuse them of that, and would they admit to saying, "Oh yeah, that's what they're doing to people who find Frank guilty in this case"?
Well, we'll get into
regardless of the evidence. They
dynamics later, but
they throw these labels at people.
This is why the ADL has this weird relationship with the KKK, because they try to tie. They claim, for instance, that the KKK emerged out of this. Out of the Leo Frank, the revitalization, of course,
which is ridiculous.
Oh, it's completely ridiculous.
Well, what they claimed was after or during the lynching, it was the writers for Mary Phagan or something like that, and this was the revival, and they're sort of putting it of the KKK. It didn't cause the KKK to spring forth, but they were saying this is like the rebirth of it.
Well, here's the Times of Israel. The Leo Frank case inspired Klan-sympathizing racists to expand the parameters of hate by including Jews, who they viewed as dishonest and alien to white society. Huh. Funny. Well, let's think about that. Do you guys know what actually revitalized the KKK?
The famous movie.
Yes, that's correct, Hank. Birth of a Nation. Who financed that? So here's Nation of Islam. Most black Americans would be shocked to learn that it was Jewish investors who financed the production of what the SPLC argues was the most racist movie ever made. A movie that glorifies anti-black violence and deifies the Ku Klux Klan. The Jewish businessmen could not have been deceived by the movie's noted director D.W. Griffith because they invested when the working title was The Klansman. Indeed, the Pittsburgh Jewish Criterion extolled the great film in its October 1st, 1915 edition. And why wouldn't they? Like so many notable Southerners, Thomas Dixon, the author of the book that inspired it, was a violently anti-black racist and effusively admiring Judeophile. So the book behind it was written by a Philo-Semite. He considers the Jews the greatest race of people God has ever created. No parallel existed for the films and the publicity that attended to it until Adolf Hitler's propaganda ministry began in Nazi Germany, blah, blah, blah. Jewish promoters greatly enhanced the Birth of a Nation's distribution worldwide, and the greatest of the Hollywood movie studios, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, was started by the famous Jewish mogul Louis B. Mayer with the profits he earned from distributing the film.
Wow.
I mean, the irony isn't lost on me that the SPLC is also I believe, Jewish-founded organization.
It's Jewish-run.
Yeah, Jewish-run, Jewish-founded. I think Morris Dees was the founder, right?
I don't remember. I can look it up really fast.
I'm like 90%.
The current iteration of the SPLC is a thoroughly Jewish organization.
And another note on the dynamics between the KKK. 10 years later, 1925, the KKK had an office next door to the headquarters of the Federation of Jewish Charities. I mean, Atlanta Jews held a fundraiser, and the governor,
it's
Clifford,
fun elevator to hang out in.
Yeah. I mean, the Atlanta Jews are holding charities with the governor and the mayor, and these guys were both Klansmen. And like the ADL, the ADL national board member Dale Schwartz, the attorney who relentlessly pursued a pardon of Leo Frank in the 1980s, which we'll get to later. He grew up in a merchant family in Georgia that sold outfits to the KKK. And he said, whenever we sold a lot of white sheets, we knew that they were going to a Klan meeting.
That's really good. Wait, so let's...
I wanted to take a break in a second and kind of reorient, but if you had something, Hank.
Well, I don't really have anything specific, but the trial sort of proceeds and then he's convicted. Obviously, is there anything more to sort of say about the trial?
Well, yeah, there's one thing to say that
I have a couple things, but go ahead.
Okay, so one important thing to say is that is left out of, remarkably left out of the so-called definitive work on the case of Steve Oney's book in the early 2000s. And the dead shall rise, is the fact of Frank's self-incrimination. So there was another witness who was very key, named Montine Stover. And she also, on the day of the exact time in question, on Confederate Memorial Day, she also came looking for her paycheck. And she found that his office was empty between 12:05 p.m. and 12:10 p.m., which, if you guys remember, was the murder took place. And Frank contradicted himself in response to this. So Frank, by the way, I should also add that Frank's what he had to say, his testimony, it was like, even the Jews, they're all embarrassed and, face palming themselves on it. He spent hours and hours just talking about the minutia of pencil production. Like, it was a giant.
He spent 3 hours during his so-called testimony during the trial talking about his job, and I guess he was trying to show these people how good of an administrator he was, and how someone of his repute could not ever commit such a heinous act. And then he concludes with, well, everything that black guy just said is a lie. And he spent, I don't know, a couple minutes on that, and he really addressed none of the details that were presented against him.
Correct. Everyone's embarrassed, and as I said earlier, he refused to be examined, cross-examined. He refused to confront the Negro, Jim Conley, etc. Well, so Montine Stover, and I should also add, most of the people who testified to his character from the factory described him as a pervert.
Well, what if they never got any of the girls there to say anything about him attempting to molest them?
I thought they did.
They never got a girl claiming that he attempted to molest them, but they had them, and we can imagine that if they had, they might not have wanted to say that. But
that's fair.
They did testify that the rumors around the factory were that, it was always some other girl, so to speak, right? And for instance, many would testify that he showed an interest in Mary Phagan, and it's been claimed that he had in the book of like employee numbers, he had her initials next to it. Her workstation was very close to his office, and Montine Stover is kind of interesting. And Montine Stover, ironically, was one of the few girls who didn't have anything negative to say about his character. didn't accuse him of being a pervert. I mean, at one point in the trial, the judge cleared out the room of all women because it got so, raunchy in the accusations about sexual perversion, deviance, etc.
So he was a well-known sexual deviant. I mean, it sounds like
and as I mentioned earlier, Albert Lasker himself, people saw him as a pervert. And I should add, by the way, his own wife refused to be buried next to him, contrary to Jewish tradition or whatever.
Huh.
So, anyways, Montine Stover, the key, this is the bombshell, really. She shows up between 12:05 and 12:10 looking for her paycheck, and he's not in his office. And so Leo Frank contradicts his earlier statement to the police as to why he was absent during this 5-minute window, at which point he says he may have unconsciously gone to the bathroom. Okay? The bathroom was in the metal room, the scene of the crime. So he admits to being at the scene of the crime when it took place. And these fucking Jews have the nerve to argue for 90 years over this fucking hair-splitting bullshit when this guy incriminates himself. And this is what came to the... And, they tarnish the character of the prosecutor, Hume Torres. They tarnish Tom Watts. They tarnish everyone involved. They tarnish the black, white, whatever. But so he admits it. He admits that... And everyone was shocked by this. He's admitting to being at the scene of the crime. And it's unconscious. Yeah, unconscious bathroom visit. So there you go. I mean, that's really what sealed the deal was his. And they don't want you to know that. If you read the work of Thomas Watson stuff, the show, but this is always admitted. Like I said, Steve Oney omits this fact. His so-called definitive book. He fails to mention this whole thing. It's just shocking. And on that bombshell, I'm gonna take a quick break here.
Well, I just wanted to put in real quick at the close of the trial, the prosecutor Hugh Dorsey delivered a pretty stunning performance in that he timed his arguments to the chiming of a nearby Catholic church bell going off at presumably 12 o'clock, and there were 12 bell tolls, the same number of a standard jury. And every time the bell tolled, he said, "Guilty, guilty, guilty," for 12 times. It's pretty well done. Now, that may be apocryphal, but I believe it's true.
Extremely metal.
For whom the bell tolls.
So I wanted to ask you guys, with all of these insane revelations coming out from Hollywood, with obviously the Harvey Weinstein case, but also a lot of people coming forward with the Me Too hashtag, pointing fingers at a lot of other people. It was just yesterday, at the time of our recording, that would be Saturday, on Saturday Night Live, when Larry David came forward with a joke, saying he noticed a pattern with all of these sexual harassment and rape allegations. It's oftentimes a Jew. That's roughly how he said it. And everybody laughed. But you can't really say that. That's anti-Semitic if you're not Jewish. And I just wanted to ask you guys, what do you think is going on? Is there actually a pattern? And then I have a few more comments about some of the people seemingly playing damage control.
Well, I mean, man, the nose knows. I mean, obviously there's a pattern. These people are...
So Milo Yiannopoulos, we've got Terry Richardson, which I didn't know was Jewish, but apparently he's being fingered, and he's been known as being kind of a pedo with all these models he chases around. You've got Anthony Weiner, who was convicted of this recently. Roman Polanski. And then you've got this weirdo Woody Allen who dated and then married his daughter.
Right.
Who's coming out
Chinese
with yet another.
Daughter, no less.
I think she's Korean or something like that. Yeah. Sun Yi. But, guys, what's going on here? Is it true?
What better way to diffuse the bomb before it really goes off than to have Juke joke about it on SNL, right? Like, oh yeah, like there was a headline like the specific Jewy perviness of Harvey Weinstein.
That they then redacted, if I recall correctly.
Right. But the point is that they're trying to say, oh yeah, it's a bunch of pervy old Jewish guys. Yeah, whatever. And then it's going to just be swept under the rug as soon as possible.
Yeah, I mean...
There have been some additional people that have come out in very articulate ways, and the spin, if you want to argue its spin, is very clever and subtle. But Alana Mercer came out with a very well-written article.
She's Jewish.
On I know, that's why I'm saying this.
Yeah.
Saying that the kind of hypocrisy of the women involved in these cases is interesting because they're essentially acting like whores. And I would somewhat agree, but it's sort of interesting that that's the sort of deflection strategy. It's one way of looking at it. Another person, Christina Hoff Sommers, is Jewish, has been saying that the scandal is akin to McCarthyism. And then you have Michael Savage, who's also Jewish and a big commentator, saying he's concerned about kind of where this is going. So it's just I don't know. It's like, can people just say like there's a problem, or do they have to represent their ethnic group? I don't know.
It's not exclusively Jewish. What I think is
no, it isn't. That's right.
It's not. So Kevin Spacey is the biggest outlier at this point for not being Jewish. His father is apparently a Nazi. But Kevin Spacey is just a wasp, homosexual, and pedophile.
His father is literally that character from American Beauty who kills them.
Yeah,
I was just gonna bring that up, but yeah.
which makes things all the more curious because I think he might have produced that film.
Well, so one of the difficult things here is the role of the movie business per se. Like, the movie business is just horrible because you have all of these actresses. They're essentially disposable, and actors too. I mean, there's a large homosexual component to this as well.
Well, that was Corey Feldman, who is Jewish, coming out and saying that a lot of people were involved in the death of his good friend Corey Haim, who's Jewish.
Terry Crews, talking about how he was just groped in the open by some producer or something of that nature at a party. And so it's an industry that's tailor-made to cause this kind of behavior, either as some kind of a mixed equilibria where you have essentially a quid pro quo arrangement, and so everybody assumes that that's kind of what's going on. And that's almost the kind of defense that Weinstein was making for a lot of these things, especially if you look at some of the transcripts in the moment. That's just what I'm used to. Of course, I'm used to these actresses, finding themselves, oh, whoopsie, I'm in a compromising situation, and then 6 months later, I'm cast in whichever role I'm after.
Well, did that tape that really nailed the final nail into his coffin, with that woman recording him propositioning her, or sort of kind of being a little bit aggressive and I need you to go sit with me, and she says no, I don't want to, and you kind of touched me last night. Did somebody put her up to that? Was that sort of
Yes, she was wearing a wire at the time by the NYPD.
Wow.
The portion in there that they were interested in, because the allegation was that the night before he had groped and assaulted her in some other context, and you had him admitting on the recording the day after, because when she asked him, why did you grab my breast? I didn't like that, etc.
Right.
He said this thing about, that's just what I'm used to.
Right.
But I mean, it seems like it is a legitimately toxic industry.
No
nobody's
question.
sane who doesn't have this sort of underlying hunger for fame would choose to go into that. As
you know what Steven Seagal said, who is Jewish, but I don't think it's relevant in this case at least. He said that exactly that about Hollywood. It is comprised of maybe 1% of people who are truly dedicated to their craft, and the rest of the group is people who are what psychologists might describe as having narcissistic personality disorder. They essentially need attention to feel good about themselves. And it's it attracts really weird people.
And that would be, you have the perfect storm. You have like an insular community that has side channels for coordinating, for brushing things under the rug. You have a position where that sort of leadership caste has immense personal control over a population of actors and actresses and assistants and whatnot that are essentially disposable. So, I mean, the fact that Hollywood is a cesspool of sexual proclivities of all kinds, and the fact that, you know, the people who run the movie industry are largely Jews, that doesn't necessarily, I guess, I mean, I could see both of those things being the case independently without forcing myself to psychoanalyze some trait of Jewish character that links to this behavior. They could very well be orthogonal.
Well, I think it's in the Talmud that they're allowed to court women older than the age of 4. It's somewhere below 10, though.
Apparently, they had tried to multiple times, perhaps even succeeded in screwing Shirley Temple.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, man. I tend to look at it, yes, as a particularly Jewish sexual perversion, because it seems to emanate more from a desire to take these symbols of that they put out there and debase them in their own ways. I mean, these guys could just as easily they had the money and the connection. They could fly in a harem of Eastern European prostitutes or whatever.
That's what they do in Israel.
Yeah, like they do in Israel. But in this case, I think there is something very symbolic on where they, it's like,
right.
We put this out to the goyim as a sex symbol, and we've already passed her around. So, haha, joke's on you. We get the goyim lusting after these women that we have made sure to have a first go with.
Should I read the perhaps misattributed but nonetheless well cited Al Goldstein, or whoever created the Screw magazine, one of the Jewish pornographers, about why they do pornography?
Right.
The only reason that Jews are into pornography is that we think Christ sucks. Catholicism sucks. We don't believe in authoritarianism. Pornography thus becomes a way to devalue Christian culture, and it penetrates to the very heart of the American mainstream and is no doubt conserved by those very same wasps. Its subversive character becomes more cherished.
I want to name off some names and allegations that involve the other side of this, which is pedophilia. It's been rumored for years, 2 individuals in particular, Bryan Singer of the X-Men franchise and Dan Schneider, sort of production guru, executive producer type of Nickelodeon, have been, these 2 men in particular have been accused of rampant pedophilia for years. Bryan Singer is a known homosexual. There is proof that he has attended parties with scantily clad young men, shall we say. Those have been proven so far to always be above the age of 18, but those are the ones we only know about. I want to name off some other names. Tyler Grasham of the APA, which is probably the biggest talent agency in Beverly Hills. And we also have some other individuals. Jason Michael Handy, production assistant for Nickelodeon, who was forced to register as a sex offender after pleading guilty to lewd acts on a child. Marty Weiss, talent manager whose clients include child actors for Nickelodeon and Disney, who pleaded guilty to child molestation. Bob Villard, a child manager who was sentenced to 8 years in prison for sexually abusing a 13-year-old boy. And if I recall correctly, a lawyer connected to Harvey Weinstein was arrested last year in either it was Manhattan Beach or maybe Santa Monica, lewd acts with a child, and was successfully indicted by the LA District Attorney. So clearly, this is a rampant problem. I don't know how much longer it's going to get swept under the rug. I think.
Well, that's the other big question. Why is it becoming a big story? Like, why did the NYPD do this now?
Well, the NYPD knew about this years ago. So did the New York District Attorney, and the case was squashed.
After a substantial donation to the District Attorney's re-election fund.
Trump being in power now, Democrats ostensibly not.
Here's a theory that I have. This is something that is often in the dissident right circles, particularly NPC, NRX, and so on, called as a preference cascade. I think that Harvey Weinstein pissed someone off, or he wasn't useful to someone anymore, and they decided to take the hinges off the door that was holding back a lot of these allegations against him. But what they maybe didn't foresee happening be the tidal wave of them everyone saying their sexual harassment story. That's where this Me Too campaign came from. Then suddenly Ben Affleck groped some chick's ass at a party. Then suddenly there's 200 allegations against James Toback, who's like a B-grade director, but somehow has, had the opportunity to harass hundreds of women in Hollywood. Then you have the allegations against Brett Ratner. And then the system just totally falls apart. Then you have the allegations against Kevin Spacey. Then you have the leading Netflix show being canceled because of this ongoing drama. Maybe someone pulled the trigger on Weinstein and it was a big mistake, or maybe someone pulled the trigger and knew this would happen because they're trying to purge certain people from Hollywood. I don't know what's going on, but I don't think this came out of nowhere. And the fact that the media is willing to cover it seems to indicate that things changed, some kind of power dynamic changed behind the scenes to allow this.
Take a look to the sky just before you die. It's the last time you will. Rock and roll, not the roar, build the crumbling sky. Jackson's gold, build the soul with a ruthless cry. Strangers now are his eyes to this mystery. Here's the silence so loud. Crack of dawn, all is gone except the will to be. Now they see what will be, blinded eyes to see. For whom the bell tolls, time marches on. For whom the bell tolls.
No white man killed Mary Phagan. It's a Negro's crime, through and through. No man with common sense would even suspect I did it. Leo Frank. So, in summary of the trial, one thing I didn't really get to in the first part was I mentioned the Burns Detective Agency and some of the chicanery that was going on behind the scenes, alluded to it at least. Burns provided he was like this. It really is something out of H.L. Mencken, and Tom Watson does a Mencken-esque service to this guy. He's like this famed detective who's going to come down and solve the case for the local bumpkins can't solve. He's hired by a Frank team, but he what he ended up providing was deeply unsatisfactory to the Jewish muscle behind Frank. And for instance, Lasker says on Burns cost me $25,000 out of my own pocket. And by God, he put in as much perjured stuff as the other side before we were finished. I don't say he did. He had his operatives, I guess. You can run that sort of thing until it embarrassed our case at times. So what kind of stuff was going on in the background here? I have a list. So I mentioned earlier the bribery of George Epps. He was the one who said that Leo Frank had made advances towards Mary Phagan, and the Burns detective, one of the Burns people, C.W. Burke, offered him money, change his testimony. There was the attempted bribery of Mary Karst, who was also a former National Pencil Company employee. There was the attempted bribery of Albert McKnight, who was the husband of Manola McKnight, who was she worked for the Selig and Frank family, and I didn't mention earlier, but she had testified, and it's not necessarily admissible evidence, much less because it's a Negro, but also just because I guess it would fall under hearsay. Hank, you could correct me if I'm wrong there, but she had heard, like, in the night of the murder that Frank was, suicidal and had confessed to his wife, etc. There was a lot of, I haven't had enough time to get in all the witnesses, but there's attempted bribery of him, and there was attempted bribery of a man named Aaron Allen. There's the blackmailing of Carrie Smith, attempted bribery of Mrs. Maggie Nash, attempted bribery of Helen, bribery of C.B. Dalton, forged evidence in the case of these letters from Annie Mott Carter, his conspiracy to murder James Conley, who's Annie Mott Carter said a Jew came up and was there too. He offered large sums of money if he put this poison in James Conley's food. Forged evidence in the form of time slip for Newt Lee, planted evidence in the form of a fresh shirt that was wiped in blood at the home of Newt Lee, who, mind you, this was the Negro that the Frank team wanted to frame, yet the Frank hagiographers and liars, they don't pin the murder on Newt Lee. They pin it on Conley. So what, Conley paid some people to plant this? Yeah, with his big, deep Negro pockets. Get the fuck out. So planted evidence in that form, planted evidence in the form of a wooden club found, quote unquote, by Pinkerton detectives in the factory. More bribery, forged letters, forged affidavits. I mean, the list goes on, and this is the kind of stuff going on in the back. So enter the great villain of the case, according to the Jews, who's, of course, Tom Watson. Now, Tom Watson, he was a populist politician, largely considered in many ways to be the voice of Georgia. He had two publications. One was Watson's Mag, and the other was the Jeffersonian. These became very crucial in the aftermath of the trial during the appeals process. And he famously said after the lynching, because people accused him of provoking this or whatever, but he said famously, lynch law is better than no law at all. That's seen by the Jews as very incriminating to Watson, but he was just saying what everybody felt. This guy was given every chance of due process, and he came up guilty. He was convicted, and then the reason he was lynched, I'll get into that in a bit, but a few notes on Watson. He was a as I said, a populist party candidate for president back in 1896 on ticket with William Jennings Bryan, candidate on his own accord in 1904 and 1908 for president, and eventually he was elected senator for the state of Georgia in 21-22. And he had a statue made of him in Georgia, and it was recently removed at the behest of pressuring from the Jewish terrorist organizations that infest our country. So no longer can you find that there. It's kind of the first. Now you see these statues coming down and stuff. Well, Watson was one first. And I'd like to read a little bit of Watson's writing just because he's a really great writer. In researching for this, I really enjoyed reading him. And he gives a very good summary. I can't remember if this is from a full review of the Leo Frank case or Leo Frank, Jew Pervert, but I'll link both of his prominent, I'll link probably 5 in the description here. But here's a taste of Watson's kind of writing. It really rallied Georgians made them very angry because he was defending their honor from these accusations by these big New York firms and stuff, saying there's a bunch of crazed mobs and stuff who really just wanted justice from this poor girl who was viciously murdered. Okay? Murdered. Of course, they don't give a damn for this girl because little Shiksa factory worker, and I could produce statements to that effect from a lot of the usual suspects. And, she was just a factory girl, and etc. So here's Watson. Now use your mother wit. Why was Frank never cast a suspicious eye or suspicious word towards Jim Conley? He was ready to put the dogs on the tracks of Newt Lee, the Negro who worked there at night. He was ready to lead the pack in the direction of Gant, the white man who came on Saturday to get his old shoes. But he was not ready to breathe the slightest hint toward Jim Conley, whom all the witnesses placed in the factory with Frank during the very time that Mary Phagan must have been ravished. Why did he keep the hounds off the trail of Jim Conley? Why did he point the finger of suspicion towards Gant and towards Lee and never towards Conley? There is but one answer, and you know what that is. Frank could not put the dogs after Conley without being run down himself. In vain did the detectives endeavor to trace evidence against Lee and against Gant. In vain did they labor to get the trail away from that factory. It was right there, and no earthly ingenuity could move it. On Monday, Frank telegraphed to Adolph Montag, who was in New York, that the factory, side note, the Montags were the factory. The factory had the case well in hand and the mystery had been solved. He had employed a Pinkerton detective, and this detective, fortunately, pinned Frank down as to where he was at the crucial hour that Saturday. Scott asked Frank, "Were you in your office from 12 o'clock until Mary Phagan entered your office, and thereafter until 10 minutes before 1 o'clock when he went to get Miss White out of the building?" And Frank, answering his own detective, said that he was. Thus, by his own admission before his arrest, placed him near the scene of the crime at the time it was committed. Scott again asked, "Then from 12 o'clock to 12:30, every minute of that half hour you were at your office?" Frank answered yes. But he lied. The unimpeachable white girl, Montine Stover, testified that she went to Frank's office during that half hour and nobody was there. And no wonder the infamous William J. Burns did his utmost afterwards to frighten the woman and force her to take back what she had sworn. No wonder he sent the rabbi after her. He himself threatened her and entrapped her in the office of Samuel Burstein and tried to get her hold her there against her will. The brassy, shallow, pretentious scoundrel. He richly deserves to be in the penitentiary himself, mind you. When Frank told his detective Scott that he was there in his office during the half hour between 12 o'clock and 12:30, he did not know that Montine Stover had been there. He had not seen her. He had not heard her. He was employed at something else, somewhere else. At what and where? In his statement, which he had months to prepare, he had said that he might have gone to the water closet. In the note that lay beside Mary Phagan's body, she is made to say that she was going to the water closet when the tall Negro, all by, quote, himself, assaulted her. Fucking. And it was on this passage to this toilet, adjoining Frank's own toilet, that the crime was committed. The water closet idea in those telltale notes, and where else? In Leo Frank's final statement to the jury, would, quote, a drunken brute of a Negro, after raping and killing a white woman within a few steps of a white man's private office with the white man inside of it, linger at the scene of his awful crime to compose 4 notes? Would he need any theory about the water closet? Would he have been in agony of labor to account for the presence of the victim at that place. Not at all. He would have left that point to take care of itself. He would have stuck a beeline for the distant horizon. Negroes committing rapes on white women do not tarry. Never, never. They go and they keep going as though all the devils of hell were after them, for they know what will happen to them if the white men get a hold of them. Jim Conley, where was he at the time when Frank was not in his office? Skip a little bit ahead. Where is the innocent white man who is afraid to face a guilty Negro? Where is the white man who would have tamely taken that Negro's fearful accusation as Frank took it? Would you have failed to face Conley? That's just a taste of Tom Watson's writing, and this is sort of they point to Watson as this, like, you know, anti-Semitic agitator or whatever, when he was a very gifted attorney himself. He had everything. These facts are all dead on the money.
So is he saying these things right after the conclusion of the trial, or
correct
after Frank gets commuted?
This is I believe this piece was before the commutation. Yeah. Because there was a little bit of an appeals process. Keep in mind, Judge Roan is pretty interesting, too, because they've claimed, for instance, that Roan himself, because he made some statement later that was they like to hold up, they meaning the Jews, like to hold up as indicative that he had like some regrets or whatever. It's kind of interesting considering that Roan sends Leo Frank to do the rope dance on his birthday. Okay.
What is the rope dance?
The hanging by neck until dead.
Hmm.
So he was sentenced to die on his birthday by the judge. So there's not exactly a lot of room to, because the judge is obligated to not like say anything about that. But in his actions, there's some indication that he was very well convinced of it himself. It's sort of a cruel thing to do otherwise. But of course, it didn't play out that way. He wasn't hung by the state of Georgia. He wasn't hung by the law. Because what ended up happening is the Shabbos Goy governor they had.
Before you get to the commutation, I think you touched upon it very briefly, but I think it serves worth going over the appeals that he attempted to get and failed.
Hundreds were filed. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Twice, I believe. And they ruled against it. So not only did the Supreme Court, but 2 lower courts, and then I guess the original trial ruled against this. So this was like 0 for 4. And at the Supreme Court level, it was 7-2.
And how do these Jews explain this anti-Semitic influence up in the North in the Supreme Court? What's going on there?
Well, my sort of observation is that it's just this guy had due process. I mean, how many more court trials do you need? I mean, maybe it's just like you can never find someone of this affiliation guilty.
Oh, they'll never be satisfied. They'll never be satisfied that we hung one of their own. Never. Never forgive. They never forget.
You know, I don't even look at it as a case of we. I mean, I'm not a Georgian, but these are
that's how they see it.
This is their
that way too.
Well,
this is a case of blood libel. It's a case of blood libel. These people have been saying, yes, sure, it's more directed at the South, but it's directed at all Gentile whites and blacks too, for that matter.
Well, that's clear.
So, anyways, yeah, Slayton was the governor at the time, and he commutes the sentence. It's also interesting to consider he could have pardoned him outright, but no, he commutes the death sentence. And he was run out of Georgia. I mean, he came really close to be lynched himself. They'll be quick to point to this. There was like an effigy of him that was hung that said Slayton, King of the Jews.
It's a good effigy.
Yeah, exactly. So he was also the first governor in American history to have to call the National Guard for his own personal protection. And like the rat that he was, he fled to New York, was welcomed with open arms by the Hearst people and the Jews up at the Waldorf Astoria, and he had to stay up there for years, and eventually he slinked back and came back to practice law at Rosser, Slayton, Phillips, and Hopkins. And keep in mind that Slayton, he was a member of the defense's law firm. Oh, God. All right. So on August 16th, 1915, a caravan of 7 to 9 vehicles bearing 25 to 35 armed men from the Atlanta area arrived at the Georgia State Prison in Milledgeville around 10 p.m., calling themselves the Knights of Mary Phagan. I could say a few things about the whole Knights of Mary Phagan thing, but I'll just leave it at that for now. They cut the telephone lines and walked into the prison, wearing motorcycle goggles, hats pulled down, and bandit handkerchiefs in triangle formation covering the lower parts of their face, surprising the guards. The men entered the barracks of Leo Frank. The intruders seized Frank and departed into the night. Many of the cars then took back roads and headed for Marietta, while one car acted as a decoy in case of pursuit. Through the early morning hours, the lynch mob who had seized Leo Frank from the Georgia State Prison in Milledgeville drove by back roads towards Marietta. Sometime early on the morning of the 17th, they reached the outskirts of Marietta. Here, at Frey's Grove, near Mary Phagan's girlhood home, the men decided to hang Frank. Though there are conflicting reports on this one. One story is that some wanted to continue with the original plan to hang Frank in the Marietta town square, while others did not want to do it in broad daylight. There's some conflict over that. But as you can see in the picture, like, people, they were all happy to be there. None of them are covering their faces or anything. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be seen bringing justice to this Jew pervert, rapist, murderer.
Yeah, this is a misconception of the whole lynching phenomenon. Like, most lynchings were done by sort of the eminent people of the community as a extrajudicial, but completely endorsed, I guess, by the local power structure, almost a fast track ad hoc administration of some sort of underlying justice. This wasn't like a crime that was committed in secret, and that's why there was this sort of celebratory atmosphere, these grotesque souvenirs and photographs. Yeah,
exactly. And that being said, they were also they honored Leo Frank's last request, which was that his wedding ring be returned to his wife, and that was that. They hung that Jew by the neck until he was dead, and he got what he deserved. And from that point on, it becomes kind of interesting because all that muscle that was behind the trial and everything, they really didn't put a lot of effort into finding the people who did the lynching. And Nation of Islam, for instance, speculates that that's because they might have had some advance notice of this, and they were perfectly happy with the outcome, because a dead Frank could easily serve the purposes of his co-ethnics better than a living pervert.
When was the photograph released of them doing the lynching?
Oh, shortly after. As I mentioned earlier, you had guys going into the one, like, sort of Gentile Jewish, like, violent conflict. The one was a Jew shopkeeper attacking a guy who had brought one in to show him or whatever.
What's also interesting is that if these are the re-emergence of the Ku Klux Klan, they're not wearing a hood.
Yeah, they weren't. That's just, again, that's the Jews attempting to hide behind blacks who they just as easily were happy to throw under the bus in the first place.
Sure. I just think this is a actually particularly poignant piece of evidence that the reason the guys were wearing the hoods was, yes, to sort of symbolize the ghosts of the dead soldiers, but also they wanted to hide their faces. And these guys aren't doing that.
The thing, too, about the whole Knights of Mary Phagan, it's a little complicated, but if I recall correctly, the source, you see that get thrown around a lot, but the real source of that actually, I think, is the New York Times, and there's not a lot of other sources of it. In many ways, it might just be like kind of a construct that was made up in the later time afterwards, but it's not especially important. But it is important to debunk that relationship between the lynching of Leo Frank and the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan.
What's interesting about like the operations behind the lynching?
Hold that thought for 1 second.
Okay.
I'm going to quote off memory, but Steve Oney described it as his paraphrase as like a well-oiled operation, well-oiled machine, much like the raid on Entebbe.
That's my new favorite metaphor.
That was the Mossad or IDF raid on Israeli Special Forces raid on the airport in Uganda.
So
also a dope movie starring Charles Bronson.
Oh yeah, it's a great movie. Yeah.
Here's some details. They had machinists cut the prison's phone lines.
Right.
And they had guys go and drain the gas out of cop cars in town. And then
not that any of them would have bothered to pursue, but yeah.
Yeah. And then they had, so there's like a 150-mile drive from Marietta and the jail in Milledgeville.
Yeah.
So they had lookouts along this drive who would signal to other lookouts further down to kind of make it clear, if anyone was coming or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it was, as Oni said, it really was a well-oiled machine. It was like more so than was probably needed. They probably could have just walked in there.
And I don't think you mentioned this, but they hung him in an oak grove owned by the former sheriff.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that is no longer there. It's like a shopping mall or something. So here's a note on the legacy of it from a Jewish historian named Schulman. So before a serious Zionist movement developed to bring them together, and before the era of a unified response to the Holocaust, German and Russian Jews were united in their reaction to the Frank Affair. Simultaneously, as the Frank Affair forced Jews inward, it also garnered them outward acceptance in the American milieu. Put simply, the Frank Affair was an opportune moment for Americanization. It may be time to consider that in the 1910s, anti-Semitism in the South may have actually helped the Jews as an ethnic people in America, which is a startlingly honest assessment of it. And I hesitate to use the word honest, but it's a frank, no pun intended, assessment. It was a catalyzing moment because the German Jews, for instance, I didn't really get into this earlier, but they did resent the ones who were well established in places like the South. Definitely resented the shtetl Jews coming in because the Jewish, they're not so much worried about. Again, it wasn't about Frank. There were 5 Jews on that grand jury who convicted in the span of 10 minutes to hang them.
I believe it was 4, but go ahead.
I think it's 5, but so it doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
The point is that it's not that they wanted to. It's not that they wanted to save him per se. They objected to 2 things. They objected to the fact that he was being tried in our courts. He was being brought justice by people who weren't them. They wouldn't. It's not that they would want to hold him accountable for killing Shiksa. They don't care. They wanted to hold him accountable for besmirching them or to drawing attention to them. That's always the issue. That's what they mean. That's why when they talk about anti-Semitism, it's noticing patterns. It's not. They already accept that people. They already have a sort of a paranoid neurosis about how people see them. It was about damage control on this, and they basically doubled down. As I mentioned earlier, some of these people, some of these big.
Was it really damage control? It's very odd that they would take such notice of this case. I guess it was the biggest story in Georgia, but was it spreading? And it seems like the way they use it, instead of trying to contain it, they try to promote it now as this propaganda piece for their own cause.
Well, I mentioned this in a Hollywood episode. There's always this tension. The shrewder Jews always think. I think Schiff was at one point among them. They want to pull back a little bit. They don't want to draw too much attention. But then some of the dumber ones.
You can't shove such blatant lies into people's face and expect them to swallow. Now, the sad fact is a lot of them do still. But
well, if you have the chutzpah, you can try. But that's the thing. That this became a coordinating. It was the first major deployment of Jewish political muscle in America. And
there's definitely a thing that you see in news coverage and what becomes a story, where it's actually the more straightforward cases kind of get buried, and the marginal cases, because they create so much controversy, they self-amplify and become the sort of object of fixation. So you'll see something like, Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin thing, where you have somebody who not necessarily had it coming, but where there's significant amounts of controversy over the circumstances. And you compare that to the reaction over that guy whose actually name I forget, who was shot in the back running away by that cop who then planted a taser next to him. Right. That cop was recently acquitted, by the way. And because it's not generating a reaction, it doesn't serve as an effective self-perpetuating propaganda campaign. What does serve as that is something that forces you to affiliate purely on the basis of identity, but with facts that are at a minimum controversial, at worst damning, that causes you to be able to create a lot of in-group, out-group tension, a lot of free media publicity. You've seen this pattern really amp up as the news cycle has gotten shorter and shorter, and different media organs have become more and more insular. But it seems like this might almost be a sort of prototypical version of that pattern.
Yeah, it ran away with itself in a certain way, and the problem became, they kept on it over the years. It's not like I asked you guys not too long ago, if you had much experience with this case, if you had heard about it.
No, I'd never heard of it, and I just did some prep for the show, but it totally escaped me.
Yeah, and I've been asking around too. It's the only people who care about this are, everyone should be aware of this, in my opinion, but the people who care about it are the Jewish liars and thug organizations like the ADL. And they've kept on it so much so that in the 1980s, they brought their pressure to bear again to try and get a pardon, which was given. But the pardon was given on the grounds that the state had failed to protect Frank, not that he was innocent of the crimes. But they hold that.
Yeah, but they'll probably never specify that detail when they talk about that.
Do that. They don't feel a need to
well, in the film that I watched, it didn't say that.
Oh yeah, of course not. Here you have
well, what's interesting to me, if you're sort of the propagandist here, we'll just make that assumption that this is propaganda for the moment. The stream of articles that are sort of drip fed into the system periodically are pretty clear. Today's search engine technology can assist in verifying this, but if you just look for the case online, you'll find from major publications pretty consistent narrative about, this was an unfortunate time in America, and the guy was innocent very clearly, and they don't really go into too much depth. But this is probably an assignment given to one of these low-level staffers. You need to go on Wikipedia, just type up some stuff to just tie it into current events and tell Americans why they should feel guilty about being anti-Semitic. The only article I could find, though, that actually said maybe he was guilty was, I'll look for the citation, but there was only one that said that.
Well, one Jew, Lenderman of Esau's Tears fame, had a relatively measured account, but you can tell he struggles to. He ultimately claims that he's not guilty, but you can tell that he's not. It's really obvious he doesn't really believe it. He's just doing what he's supposed to do. There's clearly some tension there, because Esau's Tears is a pretty, if you read it as a non-Jew or something, it's a pretty useful book, actually. But For the most part, yeah. I mean, like people like Dinnerstein, just god awful, just fake shit. And here you have like the Centennial was, of course, a couple of years ago, and you have Abe Foxman's take where it was like, on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of Leo Frank trial in Atlanta, let's begin by stating for the record, no, the Leo Frank case was not the impetus for the founding of the ADL. And he goes on to talk about mean words and stuff like that, and how it was so sad that that some millionaire Jew was denied entrance to a hotel and shit like this.
Well, this was a recent post from the Washington Post, and it said this was actually this year, back in May, Leo Frank was lynched for a murder he didn't commit. Now neo-Nazis are trying to rewrite history.
Sieg Heil. Oh yeah, the truth.
SPLC goes on to say that there is a case that only neo-Nazis would know about, and this is the case.
Yeah, no, but that's always what they do. How do you know about that?
Right.
How do you know? How do you know all these facts about the case?
Well, they always ask the same thing about like racial crime stats. Like, why do you know this?
Why do you know this? Exactly.
Yeah, why do you look at this stuff?
It's like, I thought we buried this. This effectively. No, because like they'll cut all the primary source stuff. They don't want you reading like Watson's original accounts. I recall the Wikipedia page doesn't have links to Watson's original stuff. It's like they aren't interested in the truth. It's weaponized blood libel. That's what it is. And
pattern recognition.
Very few people are interested in the truth.
Yeah. Pattern recognition and any real introspection is frowned upon.
Yeah, I mean, look, this little girl was raped and murdered, and they can lie all they want about it. But in this particular case, this particular instance, that Jew got what he deserved. And that's really, it should be the end of the story, but it's not. Instead, this goes on and on. They're going to lie and lie and lie and lie. But that's why we're here. Thank you, guys.
Little Mary Phagan, she went to town one day. She went to the pencil factory to get her little pay. She left her home at 7. She kissed her mother goodbye. Not one time did the poor child think that she was going to die. Then a villain met her with a brutal heart, we know. He smiled and said to Mary, "You'll go home no more." He sneaked along behind her till she reached the metal room. He laughed and said, "Little Mary, you've met your fatal doom." Lee was the watchman, and when he wound the key, away down in the basement, little Mary he could see. He called for the policemen, their names I do not know. They came to the pencil factory and told Newt he must go. Her mother sits a-weeping, she weeps and moans all day. She prays to meet her baby in a better world someday. Judge Long passed the sentence, you bet he did not fail. Solicitor Hugh Dorsey, he sent the Bruce to jail. Astonished at the question, the angels they did say, why he killed poor Mary upon one holiday. Now come all you good people, wherever you may be, supposing little Mary belong to you or me.